Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the CES seminars, the Fall-Winter 2014 series. And I have a distinct pleasure to introduce Professor Serhy Yekelchyk at the University of Victoria, who is the author of several books on modern Ukrainian history, including most recently Stalin's Citizens. And I believe that he will have much more to say about his scholarly accomplishments and about the topic of tonight's presentation, which is how a plaza became the Maidan, a special history of celebration and protest in modern Kyiv. So here.
It's a great pleasure to be back. As some of you know, I'm a graduate of the University of Alberta. And just this morning I was asked whether I still remember my password in order to activate my new alumni library card, which I did remember. It has been 14 years, which is truly amazing. And it is also becoming a bit of a tradition with me, for a reason that I'm not fully convinced that I know, to present here the very first approach to a new topic. The book, which came out in August this year, Stalin's Citizens, grew out of a presentation at the 2004 conference here at the UFA, if I remember correctly, on World War II, and possibly organized by David. It has been 10 years. Long in the making, and today it so happened that I'm actually presenting for the first time on something which will be my next book project. And this project is intended to look back from the recent EuroMaidan revolution in Ukraine of 2013 to 14, and to try and figure out why exactly this particular place became the center of revolutionary events, how it all happened, why the revolutionaries showed up there, and perhaps in the process to uncover a few things about Ukrainian cultural history, the way mass protests develop in modern societies, and the issues of identity as well. I know it's an ambitious agenda, but my only excuse is it's the very first presentation, right? So, as it gets narrowed down from the stage of original grant proposal, it will probably be about much less than what I think it's going to be now. But as I think of this project today, as I conceive of it today, I'm looking to start at the birth of modern politics in what is now the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv, and to see how exactly this modern politics was located in space, thus creating the space of participation, civil society, protest. It is an interesting one. We know about some early modern protests in Kyiv, which took place usually near the seat of authority. We also know about the celebrations in Kyiv, which typically took place near the seat of religious worship. In fact, from the mid-17th century, the entrance of Bogdan Khmelnytsky in Kyiv can easily be located by sources at St. Sofia Square, next to the Cathedral of St. Sofia. And this indicates to us that the place of worship gives birth to the place of celebration, because these two processes are linked in early modern period and possibly later as well. What about the space of protest? There is no clear answer in the sources we get, other than the Lithuanian castle was apparently, the Lithuanian castle is now near Andriivsky Uzviz, just on the hill, and apparently the Lithuanian government would like to assist Ukraine in restoring the castle. That the Cossacks were at some point protesting under the castle against the decisions of the Polish governor. That's about all that came down in terms of political traditions. What about modern politics, though? There is, in fact, a very clear date when it was born in Kyiv, and also an architectural artifact which was connected with the birth of modern politics. And it was located on Khreshchatyk. As most of you probably know, Khreshchatyk Boulevard is Kyiv's main avenue today. This is also the avenue crossing Maidan Nezalezhnosti, which has been the site of recent protests. Now, Khreshchatyk is a relatively new street. It definitely does not have the tradition of either protest or celebration going back to the early modern period or beyond that. In fact, Khreshchatyk is being built in the 1830s. In the 1830s still, the aristocratic part of Kyiv is Pechersk. Next to the fortress, next to what is now the Arsenal factory, next to what is now Arsenal metro station, when Gogol comes to Kyiv to stay with Maximovich, this is where he stays, this is where he undergoes religious conversion, as a matter of fact. Somewhere in there, Maximovich says that his house was between the Ypsilanti house and the gates of the fortress, so I can approximately locate it on the map of present-day Kyiv. But in the 1840s, Khreshchatyk is being constructed, and the fashionable aristocratic part of Khreshchatyk is what is now the European Square, which is at the time known as Teatralna Square because of the theater being built there, which burned down eventually and did not, of course, survive. It takes a while for Khreshchatyk to become a fashionable area. It is, in fact, the same transformation we would observe in a number of European cities at the time. Transformation connected with the removal of fortifications. Also in Kyiv, ironically, it is not so much the removal of fortifications as the relocation of fortifications and the construction of additional fortifications in the city, which in fact starts in the 1840s at the time when in Paris and Vienna they are in fact considering what to build in place of those fortifications, and then Ringstrasse and the grand boulevards are being constructed. Khreshchatyk is perhaps the nearest equivalent in what is now Ukraine to the grand boulevards in Paris. It is becoming, in the 1860s to 70s, a fashionable area for strolling during the day. In the evening, this is the place occupied by prostitutes and young men in search of adventure, and not a place where bourgeois society of the time would find it appropriate to stroll. Nevertheless, it is at this point already connected with the concept of a popular festivity and celebration. The square in question, what we now know as Maidan, already exists, referred to in sources as Khreshchatycka Ploshchad, Khreshchatyk Square. It is in the same place, and it is actually the place where traveling circus establishes its tents when it is in town, because there is no permanent circus at the time. It's also the place of carnival and celebration on all kinds of festive occasions, and fireworks too, which is kind of, given all the fires in the city over the centuries, doesn't strike me as a particularly great tradition. This all changes all of a sudden in 1876, which might as well be the year we establish as the foundation of modern politics in Kyiv. It is, in fact, connected to the reform of municipal administration in the Russian Empire, starting in the 1870s, and the creation of elected city council. Immediately, the center of urban politics switches to such councils, and it acquires a spatial representation, the focus, when the building of the city council is constructed in 1876. It is an impressive building and stands right in the center of what is now Maidan Nezalezhnosti. It also has a balcony, which, needless to say, is important for the birth of modern politics, because in order to make any important pronouncement, you go on the balcony. You can also wave flags from the balcony. Ideally, you would also build some monuments before the building, and this is coming indeed later on. So from 1876, urban political life acquires a focus right in the middle of Rashad, in what is now Independence Square or Maidan, the Duma building or the city council building. However, it really stretches until 1905 that this politics or political focus becomes the focus of mass politics. Of course, what happens in 1905 is the revolution in the Russian Empire, which also takes the form in Ukraine of a general strike and other such manifestations. In Kyiv, the events of October 1905 in particular signal the transformation of rather limited urban politics, which existed prior to that, into mass protest politics. This mass protest politics needs a focus, and in contemporary sources, it is curious to see how the protesters are in fact searching for a spatial focus, where to go to protest. They cannot spread over the city. It doesn't also work to march from one point to another. They actually feel like they need to occupy something, which sounds like a very modern concept. In the end, they do occupy something. It all starts, needless to say, with the building of Kyiv University, which is now known as the Taras Shevchenko Ukrainian National University, and also my undergraduate alma mater. Why there? Well, a couple of factors. A, massive participation of students as a force of radical protest and change in 1905. Location convenient in a sense that there is a major park right in front of the university, which you can occupy. The campus itself is gated. It still is, by the way, gated. And it was gated back then. So if you get inside the gates, then you can occupy campus, or at least the so-called red building and what is behind the red building of the university. And also, the park is already marked with political connotation, as it is today, and as it was during the 20th century, when the Shevchenko monument was there. But of course, back in the day, in 1905, it is the monument to Nicholas I, which stands in the same foundation as the Shevchenko monument today. So for protesters showing up in Shevchenko Park, it was not like for 20th century students an expression of Ukrainian national identity, showing up to demonstrate under the monument of Shevchenko that we are Ukrainians. On the contrary, in 1905, for them it was actually the intention to desecrate the monument to the Tsar, to the oppressive Tsar, and to remove the royal symbols from the postament, from the foundation. This is exactly what they do. And they converge in the park. However, very soon, the protest switches to Rashad and to the Dumska Square, which is exactly the location of today's Maidan, and for the reason that it is perceived as a center of political life in the city, that it is actually the city Duma which needs to be occupied rather than the university, because by so doing you would actually take power in the city. This is the seat of power. They don't actually consider, and this is curious, the governor's palace in Pechersk. But this is probably because they realize that it is guarded closely. There are lots of military installations around. There's a fortress there. And it is not as easy to access from the working class neighborhoods of Podil and Shlyavka. So huge crowds show up. This is mid-October 1905. Huge crowds show up in what is now Maidan, which is known as the Dumska Square. They show up at the building of the Duma. There is no monument at that point, and that is really actually going to be an important point in the book as well, that periodical appearance of various monuments at this place is significant. In 1905, there is none. The crowds show up, they capture the building and they destroy the portraits of the emperors within the building, remove all the regal paraphernalia, and by so doing claim Republican power, at least symbolically. A Bolshevik speaker, Comrade Schlichter, shows up on the balcony and starts yelling various slogans. The crowd grows considerably into the thousands, and at some point a mounted police shows up to disperse the crowd, which they do, in the process killing something like 20 people and arresting over 100. This, however, is not the end of the story, but only the beginning. Because what follows almost immediately after the events of October, I think, 17th, 1905 in Kyiv is the counter-Maidan, just like today. The patriotic forces which support monarchy, Russian Orthodox faith, start spreading leaflets in the city that the revolution has been organized by the Jews, of course. Who else? And they also organize groups of shopkeepers, workers, who also acquire a focus in railway repair depot near the railway station, which is in the same place where it is today. And from there they march throughout the city symbolically, from a desecrated monument to the Emperor Nicholas I, to the Duma, and to the editorial offices of the conservative newspaper Kyiv Lenin. And from them on, they start the Jewish pogrom, which is at that point one of the most violent expressions of anti-Jewish violence in the entire Russian Empire, which lasts for several days. The city authorities refuse to take measures for a variety of reasons, arguing that, well, the governor has been removed, the new governor is vacationing in France, nobody seems to have any authority, and kind of really a good idea to beat up the revolutionaries. In reality, what is going on is actually a Jewish pogrom, which results in a number of casualties, and hundreds wounded, number of houses destroyed and businesses destroyed, until it finally is. Finally, the military authorities issue an order to put a stop to the pogrom. And this event in 1905 really creates a model, a pattern for the Maidan, anti-Maidan movements in this very same physical space. What happens in 1917? By 1917, the very same square actually is marked with a monument, and this is the monument to Stolypin, the Tsarist statesman, a symbol of strong imperial Russia which he wanted to build. And so when the revolutionary crowds converge on the Dumska Square in the spring of 1917, one of the first notions for them is actually to remove the monument, which they do. There are numerous photographs in contemporary press and in the archive of the process of removing the monument. It's rather large and heavy and difficult to remove. And of course, needless to say, there's disagreement in the crowd at this point. Nobody is actually in the crowd defending openly in an organized way. The anti-Maidan forces are disorganized in 1917, but they are going to fight back when the Denikin armies enter the city. And strangely enough, with yet another pogrom. Not just of the Jews, but also of Ukrainians as well, because at this point, those who establish a new order, democratic order, are conceptualized not just as revolutionaries identified with Jews, but also as Ukrainians, Mazepists, rebelling against the Russian imperial order. And in the city of Kyiv, as you know, there's a considerable representation of conservative elements who, in fact, during all the elections in 1917 and later, give majority to the Russian conservative bloc, which they renamed a couple of times during the revolution, but it consistently wins during the municipal elections. So the counter-Maidan, the anti-Maidan is there very much present. When the Bolsheviks take power, They rename Khreshchatyk, they rename the square a couple of times, and they construct a monument to Karl Marx. The monument to Karl Marx, it's a constructivist monument, and it's not a long-lasting monument. It's actually a cement monument, or alabaster, I'm not quite sure what material it was. It was disintegrating already by the 1920s, and people were making fun of this temporary constructivist, cubist monument, which to my mind looks interesting, but still. But it's important somehow to symbolically reclaim the space where Stolypin used to be, to put something in this position dominating the square, dominating the, the eastern side of the square. And the monument to Marx is almost exactly in the same space where the monument to independence now is, the column of independence. Curiously enough, even so, the Bolshevik political order has an ambition to totally control the population and political life. There are, in fact, spontaneous political protests in this very space in the late 1920s that are helpfully documented for us by such an observer as academician Serhy Yekelchyk, a prominent Ukrainian intellectual who, thank God, kept his diary, and which is now published. And this is how we find out that academician Yekelchyk is riding a tram. 1928. And from the tram, he sees some kind of crowd. This is October 1928. He sees a crowd of approximately 500 people, possibly more, standing in front of the building, which now houses, of course, not the Municipal Duma, but the Vykonkom, or Ispolkom, which is the Soviet equivalent of municipal administration. And these people look like they're expecting something. They also hold red banners. So Yefremov thinks that this must be some kind of Komsomol anniversary. But that's his kind of favorite explanation for everything. This must be some kind of Komsomol anniversary. So he just goes on his business, only to find out later on from the leaflets distributed at the Opera House, actually, that that was the manifestation of the left opposition, the Trotskyist opposition. So protesting the evolution of the Bolshevik regime into a dictatorship, a bureaucratized dictatorship. Well, lo and behold, 1929, academician Yekelchyk is riding the tram again, past the building, and here he sees a different crowd which looks different. It doesn't have any red banners at all, but it is being beaten up by some strange characters who look like police agents. And later on, mounted police shows up. This is the year 1929, and these are the people who did not receive bread ration cards, who were judged not being eligible to receive bread rations in the city of Kyiv for whatever reason, and they showed up to protest before the building. So purely economic, in a sense, protest, and they are violently attacked just as the oppositionists were a year ago by the mounted police, dispersed and arrested. There's actually a very interesting continuity, possibly, between these events and the events of 1905, because we know from the leaflet that at least one participant of the 1928 oppositional manifestation on Maidan was in fact a worker and a member of the party from 1902. So chances are that he would have participated in the events of 1905, and in any case, there would be an understanding, a tradition by now, that this is where you go to protest, whether you're protesting the Tsarist power, or you're protesting the Bolshevik authorities, or you're protesting not getting a bread ration card from the municipal authorities. This is where you show up. And what I'm actually going to argue in this project is that it starts in a space which is marked by the presence of political authority. But later on, this space actually acquires a symbolic significance of its own, regardless of the fact of the existence or non-existence in the place, on this location, of any political authority. In fact, the political authority could be elsewhere. It could be the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Ukraine up the hill over there. But you are still protesting down below because this is the place which is perceived as a central symbolic place of protest. And another part of my argument is that, in fact, when people decide spontaneously, perhaps instinctively even, what is going to be the central symbolic place of protest, they also take into account not just the location of authority or the past location of authority, but also the space of celebration. To put it simply, it would be the parade ground where the Soviet power would force people to march with red banners and various slogans. So when the people decide to protest, they go into the same space because the space is already marked as political space. The marching space, the allegedly celebrating space, but when you protest, you actually go into the same space and you reclaim this political aura, this logic of political participation, which is purely formal in Soviet times, but you make it informal and genuine. Now, in 1934, Kyiv becomes the capital of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and the Soviet authorities actually consider what to make the best parade ground for the new capital. Khreshchatyk is too narrow at the time. None of us would, of course, remember the pre-war Khreshchatyk. My dad has vague memories of what it was like. Now the old postal office building has been destroyed with the name of building of some skyscraper, which at the moment there is nothing in the space. But that was the last building which marked the old narrow Khreshchatyk, because when it was rebuilt after the war, it was rebuilt on a much wider scale because Khrushchev wanted a place for parades. However, before the war, the Soviet authorities wanted to make something else a place for parades, the parade ground, and they were actually looking at the upper town, very close and perhaps including the traditional place of religious worship and celebration, the St. Sofia Square. They actually wanted to combine the Mikhailivska Square, where the St. Michael Cathedral stands, with St. Sofia Square and make a parade ground there, which actually made perfect sense from the point of view of symbolic politics, except I kind of doubt that they were thinking in these categories, but even if they were not, that made perfect sense. Actually, before that, you read in some memoirs from the 1920s, the Bolsheviks tried to reclaim this religious space in a very curious way, in a carnivalesque way. Because Easter celebrations, for instance, were still taking place in the 1920s by St. Sofia Cathedral, so the Bolsheviks would show up, the Bolshevik activists would show up with pipes, dressed as fake priests, driving around in cars, beeping, and trying to disrupt in various ways the religious celebrations in a carnivalesque way. They tried it a couple of times, it didn't work. So they could not reclaim this space, and they decided to create one large square, which never was in fact created, except they blew up the St. Michael's Monastery for that purpose. So they were working on this place of celebration, but it was never materialized. When the Soviets retreated from Kyiv in 1941, as we all know, they blew up most of the buildings on Khreshchatyk. Today's researchers think that the underground company of Ivan Kudrya, there's actually a street named after Ivan Kudrya in Kyiv, actually did it. In such a way that Khrushchev was not even sure that there ever existed such an order. Anyway, Khreshchatyk was destroyed. So when the Red Army came back in 1943, there was no place to hold a parade. And there was no place to hold a demonstration, which is a civilian parade in Soviet parlance. So they actually used Volodymyrska Street up there at the Opera House, which was not satisfactory in any respect, and you couldn't send too much military hardware down Volodymyrska, but they used it until the reconstruction of Chreshchatyk was more or less complete. The first pictures of post-war parades, and they're actually in my book which came out in August, show still the ruins of Chreshchatyk, but already a parade with pictures of Stalin and Lenin there. So they badly needed such a space. And the space was, again, down below Chreshchatyk. Well, fast forward then to October 1990, when a group of students showed up in early October to symbolically reclaim this space from the authorities and make it again a space of protest after a hiatus of several decades. Who were they and why did they show up? The square has been reconstructed in the late 1970s, and I have vague childhood memories of the square being reconstructed. The reconstruction, the Soviet reconstruction of the square, involved a large fountain in the center, but more importantly, a colossal monument to Lenin and the revolutionary workers at the eastern end. This happens to be the same eastern end, really, except higher on the hill, where the monument to Stolypin stood, the monument to Karl Marx stood, and where the monument of independence, the column of independence, is now standing. So the logic of building a monument dominating the square in approximately the same space, which would have made perfect sense, of course, if the building of the city hall were still standing, because the monument would be actually the opposite the balcony from which Comrade Schlichter was yelling his slogans. Would in fact be dominating the space where the crowds, the revolutionary crowds, gathered on all these occasions in 1905 and 1917. But of course, the Duma building did not survive the war. When Ivan Kudry and his fellow underground Soviet guerrillas blew up the entire Chreshchatyk, they of course also have destroyed the city hall as well. Its burned shell actually existed for most of the war, but there was no way to rebuild it. And in fact, the space was left empty during the reconstruction of Chreshchatyk after the war. And thus the Soviet authorities, actually, what they did, they thought they were creating a colossal square, which would not be good for parades, because parades would have to involve marching, right? But would be good for rallies, potentially. And the first rally held on this square, ironically, was the execution of Nazi war criminals, the hanging, which was a major event in the history of Kyiv at the time, involving colossal crowds. There's a photograph in my book. My mom and dad would, when they saw the book, they said, "Oh, I was there," and he would say, "I was there as well." Like, everybody was there. So that's the first rally actually held by the Soviet authorities, kids showing up to look at the hanging. But it is thus established already symbolically as the main place in town. And also, some would remember that this is the place where you would go to protest before the war. This is the place where the circus would spread out its tents in the 19th century. This is the same place. This is the main square with political meaning. Not just the main square to go to be entertained. It's the main square with now political meaning too. Place of executions as well. And so this large space is created. In 1976 to 77, a very large monument to Lenin, as I said, is constructed at the eastern end of the square, close to the hotel, which is at the time known as Hotel Moskva, and now is known as Hotel Ukraina, which I find a rather symbolic way of renaming a hotel. The monument was very large. I do have, from my undergraduate days, vague memories of what it was like. It was very large. It was a kind of Lenin showing the way. Lenin surrounded by a group of rather grim-looking workers and soldiers, and I think one woman, too. Lenin was a granite sculpture, and the workers, soldiers, and the woman were from some kind of metal. This monument, because it was so grand, in order to position it symbolically as dominating the square, granite steps were constructed leading to the monument. And it is on these granite steps that student protesters show up in October 1990. I should probably say already at this point that the catalog of student protesters showing up in October 1990 includes a lot of recognizable names and a lot of people who are now deputies of the Ukrainian parliament, a lot of people who participated in the Orange Revolution, and quite a few who were active in the most recent EuroMaidan. So there's actually a very interesting continuity in personnel as well as continuity in the concept of peaceful protest located in this particular space. Except, remember I said that the space has to be marked, but then it kind of stays on symbolically, even if the marker is already absent. Of course, the Lenin Monument would be removed in 1990, but the square would stay as a place of protest. Even so, there is really nothing on the square itself which would symbolize the regime against which you are protesting. There is no institution of power, because since the city Duma was destroyed in 1941 by fire, there is no monument now, there is nothing. But there is already a symbolic continuity, already the aura of this space as a space of protest. There's a central political space, which of course now becomes also a virtual space and national space, as I'm hopefully going to argue in the latter chapters of the book when it is completed. Students show up in early October 1990, and they show up for a hunger strike on the granite steps leading to the monument. A hunger strike which has a shifting target, really, because the original demands of students are not what the final demands are. And in the final form, the demands include the re-election of the parliament, the removal of the cabinet, halting the negotiations of the Union Treaty. This is the period when the Soviet Union is, Gorbachev is trying to salvage the Soviet Union. And the stationing of army recruits from Ukraine in Ukraine itself, unless they agree to serve outside of the Ukrainian Republic. Okay, so I by now have two kinds of motivation of why exactly you would show up in this space, right? There's actually three. Tradition, the presence of political institutions nearby, and the symbolic presence of something you want to protest against. And in fact, all three are present in October 1990 when students show up in the full knowledge that they are likely to have the support of a Kyiv city council. The national parliament is still dominated by the conservative communist group of 239 deputies. Some of us would remember this magic number, 239, the group of 239. But the municipal council in Kyiv is more democratic. And it has a larger group of democratic deputies. In fact, the blue and yellow flag is going to be raised very soon by the city council, like way before it is raised over the parliament. And so students do it in the knowledge that they are likely to get a support of the municipal council, which is now housed in a relatively new building from the late 50s, relatively, well, nearby, next door, one could say. Not on the square, but very close to the square. And they also want to use this hunger strike as a method of putting pressure on the government and on the parliament. Even so, the parliament is up there in Pecharsk, and the government is also up there in approximately the same area, like quite, quite a distance it would take if you march as a column. So they set up, originally they just show up with mattresses, and in the evening they set up the tents as soon as they received the word that the Kyiv Municipal Council in fact allowed peaceful action on the square if it does not interrupt traffic on Rashad Boulevard. And this is the reason, in fact, why the students going on hunger strike set up the tents on the granite steps, and this is the reason why it becomes known as the revolution on the granite. Because they do not intercept, they do not hamper with, they do not stop the traffic at first. Eventually they will. But at first they don't. For the first, I think, 2 weeks of the strike, they don't. But there's also a deeper symbolic meaning to it, because they're actually right under the monument, and there is a lot of discussion in the city and in Ukraine in general about dismantling Lenin's monuments, and already in Western Ukraine, Lenin's monuments are being dismantled. And this one is going to be dismantled soon as well. Now, in order not to spend too much time on this one, because I think I did more reading on this particular page than potentially on others, but to keep the balance, what is going on there is, of course, that the authorities are forced to negotiate with students. And in order to negotiate with students, they come to the square from the parliament. So that's the first step. Leonid Kravchuk, who is head of the parliament, actually comes to the square to negotiate with Oles Doni, who today is, of course, a deputy. And there are numerous pictures of how this is going on. This is covered on television. And this is really the first time when the country is getting a sense of democratic politics right there in the center of the capital, with television coverage and newspaper coverage of the authority figures showing up on what is now Maidan, thus establishing the reputation of this place as a place where real politics is made. Unlike the parliament, still dominated by the group of 239, it is actually there on the square. You have to talk to the students with white bands symbolizing hunger strike, and they are joined by at least 2 deputies of the parliament. They are joined by some cultural figures, some historians, and the list, some writers. The list goes on. So a symbolic hunger strike. And as you probably know, it ends in the same month of October with the removal of the head of the government. That's the main concession. The head of the cabinet, Vitold Fukin, is removed, which is far from being the entire list of student demands, but which is a really important, once again, symbolic gesture. So the students have won, at least on this, most obvious, most important, perhaps, point. Now, as this first Maidan is unfolding, there are interesting signs that they are not quite sure, really, how to take advantage of this new space of protest they have created. There are diversions. Columns of students are marching through the city. At one point, they decide to march to a major factory, the Bolshevik factory, the former Gretar and Krivanek. They come to the factory. There is nobody meeting them there. And this is still the age when people have illusions about workers becoming potentially a force for the transformation of the Soviet Union. Minor strikes are still big news. And so students turn around, and other protesters turn around, and they say, okay, we're not going to do that. We're going back to the Maidan, to the familiar space. Then they have another detour at some point, and this is already after they actually closed traffic, which is a more serious sign of indicating to the authorities that you better negotiate with us. You cannot just ignore us, right? They march to the Parliament building, and that really becomes a feature of the subsequent Maidans as well in 2004 and most recently 2013-14. That your main camp is in fact in Independence Square, this important symbolic place where you camp out there, and this is where people join you, both physically and symbolically and virtually these days through social networks. But from there, you in fact from time to time march on something. And march on the parliament for the first time actually happens in October 1990, and the students come that close to storming the parliament building. But because of the lack of communication, they don't actually know that this is the plan of the student leadership to storm the government building if a chance presents itself. So they, in fact, the advanced group of students is trying to sit down on the stairs of the parliament and continue a hunger strike there. But that allows the police to close down the ranks and create another cordon. And so eventually they march back to the Maidan. And then at one point, they actually do exactly the same thing as in 1905. They leave the Maidan to occupy the campus of Kyiv University, the red building of the Kyiv University, which I'm not sure if they are in fact aware, if they were aware of historical continuities as being almost a century between the two events. So they are not actually staying, they are not quite sure, they are creating a new tradition. So they are trying essentially to mobilize various groups of population, and in so doing they are promoting the birth of mass politics in Kyiv. Now, because I've spent quite a bit of time on the 19th century, 1905 and 1990, let me quickly go through what happens in 2004 and most recently, because we are, in a sense, witnesses of these most recent revolutions. But they do demonstrate important trends. By far the most important I already hinted at. The space's symbolic meaning has been established, so we don't really need this space to contain either any monuments or administrative buildings representing real political power. In fact, they are elsewhere in the city, and yet people still converge on the main square because it is already imbued with the meaning of the central square of protest, the Maidan. Has been renamed with the collapse of the Soviet Union from the October Revolution Square to Independence Square. Lenin Monument has been removed. The square itself has been remodeled in 2001 with the addition of the Column of Independence with some kind of woman with wings and whatever, looking at the place where the municipal council used to be before the war, which is of course now an empty space, and in fact with underground shopping malls, which is curious. There's some irony embedded in this as well. In fact, there's also an even more expensive shopping mall right under the Monument of Independence. Now, occupying this square today, of course, does not mean at all that you're protesting against this particular monument, this particular building, or the authority positioned in this building. They are elsewhere. It becomes a symbol of national protest and also more abstract symbol of democracy and people's power. And I think this meaning was established really by the student hunger strike of 1990 and confirmed by the events of the Orange Revolution in 2004. It is important to note that, of course, the Orange Revolution of 2004 started in this political space because it was very well planned by opposition leaders, the so-called Maidan commanders, who knew in advance or strongly suspected that the government would want to forge the election results. And so, as we know from the chronicles of the Orange Revolution, for instance, very large television screens were delivered to Maidan even before the announcement of results. So they kind of assumed that the government would be claiming victory and there would be a protest rally there. And so, therefore, television screens would need to be delivered. Now, what happens with the Orange Revolution is something already noticeable to a very small degree, really, in the events of 1990. And that is the transformation of the space of protest into the national space of protest for the entire country. In 1990, it all started with the student societies of Kyiv and Lviv coordinating their participation in the protests, and the original group of student occupiers of these granite steps actually included almost an equal proportion people from Kyiv and Lviv. But they only represented really a small segment of the society, namely radical students. What happens in 2004 going into 2005 is that the Maidan becomes a center for protest action, for democratic action on a national scale. And not just that people actually show up spontaneously or being organized by local democratic organizations from the regions, but they also show up with signs that we are from this oblast. We are from such and such city or town. And this is, by the way, what you observe on the present Maidan as well, until it was dismantled. And the tents designated as Sotnya такого-то места. So it becomes an important, Maidan becomes not only a place of political action, but it also becomes, and there is some interesting analysis, for instance, of how the revolution in the Czech Republic, in the Czechoslovakia, was made by becoming a place where you represent yourself, and also a place of carnival where you undermine the old authorities by having your satirists perform and having your rock groups perform in the name of the nation, in the name of the people. So it's important not just to have political action happening there and to apply pressure to the authorities, but to demonstrate for your own sake as much as for the sake of political pressure that in fact we are the people from this region and it is thus a national phenomenon. This is also pronounced in the most recent Maidan of 2013 to 2014. And another trend I wanted to mention, and these later chapters of the book are really something I'm still trying to conceptualize, how they're going to unfold, is the virtual dimension. Namely, the colossal presence of social media beginning in 2004, and especially in the present, in the most recent Maidan, but also the fact that it is not just the physical space any longer. So the very concept of this being a symbolic place of political action is given a new dimension, or perhaps confirmed in an interesting way, by the fact that it is also an internet phenomenon. That by joining a Facebook group, EuroMaidan, for instance, right? You are already making a statement and joining this movement, even so you are physically perhaps in Edmonton, Alberta, or Victoria, British Columbia. Right? And there would be other ways for you to participate if you are so inclined, but it no longer actually requires the physical presence. Also, it is important for visiting foreign leaders, including Canada's foreign minister, and I think Stephen Harper as well. Did he go to Maidan? Yeah, well, you see. So it's important. So it's important to show up there now that there are no monuments. Then foreign politicians can show up, no competition for them. But now that it has become a virtual phenomenon, it also becomes a symbol you can partake of without actually being there. You can identify with it. It becomes a code word to which various political designations are attached. For instance, in the Russian press, you would read about the Maidan Nazis, right? Whereas on the other side of this debate, you would read about the EuroMaidan as symbol of democracy and political participation. And yet, in both cases, the Maidan is the symbol of the movement happening. So it is thus acquires the dimension when it is actually the phenomenon which people can fight over without, in fact, being there. So a virtual phenomenon, a phenomenon of political interpretation and analysis. And now, the last few pages in this imaginary book, which will probably take years to write, would of course be about Maidan translating into political power and authority, and also the actual cleanup of the Maidan. I don't know how many of you went to Ukraine this summer. I actually went twice. And both of my trips involved the moments when the authorities tried to clean up the Maidan, and the activists were actually split on the issue of whether it's a good idea or not, whether it still represented the ideas of the revolution. And what I loved in this argument was, of course, the concept that there could be an idea of Maidan which is separate from the actual physically existing Maidan in the present. That it could deteriorate and degrade into something else. It's almost like a Trotskyist argument about the Bolshevik Revolution. This is the idea of the Maidan, which existed until such and such months, and the Maidan right now, it is something totally different. And the second one was how the concept of how it translates, whether it actually translates into political, into democratic political action beyond Maidan. So whether there could be any lessons derived from mass politics of protest and actual results beyond simple political manipulation during the elections, which no doubt are coming in October, that I was there, I was with you, or like I prevented the dissolution of the Maidan, or things like that. Whether Maidan can, in fact, be translated into meaningful slogans of political participation, for instance, along the lines of fighting corruption. Because the legacy of Maidan is already being formed, and it's being formed in a variety of interesting ways. For instance, some of you would know that leftist feminist groups tried showing up at the Maidan, and at first met with the lack of understanding from those people positioning themselves as the guards of the Maidan, until they explained that this is what Europe is all about, right? EuroMaidan, so Europe involves this as well. So Europe is not just about the nation, but also about democracy and feminism. That probably is connected to the revolution, not just for the generation of
you know, the religious connotation by becoming a political revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Except it's separate space in Kyiv, which is interesting because there is no really, which re-emerged. However, the connection did re-emerge in the recent events, in St. Michael's Monastery becoming a refuge for the wounded, right? And also rumors circulating widely that Titushki, or the anti-Maidan forces, are congregating at the Lavra, the Russian Orthodox Church, and they are marching from there, which is the entire separate topic. In fact, I'm going to have a conference presentation soon on that one, on the spatial positioning of anti-Maidan, which is also determined by the same factors plus the positioning of the actual Maidan. And they kind of move together in tandem.
I enjoyed your talk very much. I have a question that is a follow-up to your last statement. You were talking about anti-Maidan and then the role of the Russian Orthodox Church. We know very well where some of the funding sources comes to the present anti-Maidan. How was it in the early periods? Was the Russian Orthodox Church also involved in funding the anti-Maidanists?
I think the authorities in the Russian Empire identified with the concept of Russian Orthodoxy to such a degree that the church did not even have to do this legwork for them.
It was done for them.
It was done, yeah, it was done in the name. And the recent book by Faith Hillis, which is entitled The Children of Rus, which I'm reviewing for some journal, has a review on some journal. Of course, this name of the book, The Children of Rus, is taken from a leaflet of the anti-Maidan at the time. Yeah, which is pretty stunning. But this is how the official ideology of the empire fits very nicely the mood of the pogromщiks. So they don't need to have a separate force for that, because that's pretty much the official line. Whereas today it has to be established in some way, both in physical space and conceptually as well, in a sense of establishing relation to Soviet legacy, the Orthodox legacy, the concept of the great Russian people and such. So today you have to argue what it is exactly, like what is this St. George's ribbon, for instance, or like what is Novorossiya. And these constructs emerge precisely because they need to argue against something already established, concepts of A, independent Ukraine, B, democratic Europe, like these kind of things.
It was really wonderful when you were talking about how it became a virtual space and symbolic space. And people indicated the Kyiv Maidan, even though their physical face didn't quite fit such an invitation, but they tried to. I think that would be
Yeah. Oh, thank you. That's going to be a really important dimension of my project, actually. I'm trying to make inquiries with some friends, and when I go back on Facebook, some of you will be getting messages from me asking about the cities you are originally from, what in fact happened in those cities. Because in Kharkiv, for instance, like Maidan and EuroMaidan, the anti-Maidan and Maidan were separated by two squares, and of course it's the square with the Shevchenko monument, which is the Maidan square, and it's the Lenin Monument, which marks, as I understand, the anti-Maidan square. So it has a lot to do with political symbolism, and I'm still investigating a couple of other cities I want to use as comparison, keeping in mind, though, that only Kyiv really provides you with a national scene, which is the reason why all these people go there by bus, by train, and spending nights at the House of Trade Unions, which, by the way, is what is also going on in 1990 already. This tradition is established back in 1990, so they are spending nights and getting hot meals at the House of Trade Unions, which was burned down, as we know, during the most recent protests.
Continue on the scene, and of course all the sympathy Maidans that appeared in places like Edmonton and elsewhere, which you talk about the Maidan going down into a social network, but the social network then populates other cities with Maidans. Ours was in this just before City Hall.
So it produces political action then, yeah. We also had it before the City Hall, actually, in Victoria, but it's really small, yeah. Yes, and it then becomes the most visible, or next to seat of political authority, not the parliament, though. Actually, this is what we debated in the Ukrainian community in Victoria, whether we should try for the steps of the legislature, which, of course, in British Columbia we call the parliament, or whether we go for a city hall, which I was sitting there in this meeting of the Ukrainian Studies Society and thinking, that's exactly what my book is going to be about. Like, this is a decision you make. And these are the factors. These are the factors which go through your mind.
I had a question about the role of geography, and I don't really know whether you consider this at all. But I was trying to imagine that central square here, without any building, and it's a little bit like my own home city of Sheffield, which is built on 6 hills. Right? And if you do that, maybe everything apart from where the Scatterers goes down from the hills to the center. You know, in other words, this would be sort of a natural geographical place to gather. And maybe if you go back further, before the 19th century, you might find other examples of gathering in this place.
I thought so, David. Well, actually, you know what? It does make perfect sense in a sense that it is relatively easy to quickly descend on the square from several streets going downhill from all sides, and this is a factor actually both in protesters showing up and in police units trying to break the protest by kind of incursion from one of those streets. The thing about Rashad is that it's such a new street. It was actually swamp in the early 19th century. So they need to bring, so it takes a while. So people live on the hills above Rashad on this side and on that side. And actually most prestigious neighborhood is Kostolna Street, which still is extremely prestigious. And the climate of Rashad itself is thought to be unhealthy in the early 19th century. It's too damp, I guess. And really after a huge rain, it becomes like one huge swamp. So I wonder whether political action in the early modern period also migrates with a seat of authority. And there is no, this is something I need to look up really, because you can go back to 1113. The crowds in Kyiv are protesting the moneylenders' raid approved by the prince, and they're beating up the moneylenders, and the prince escapes, and then where do they go? Do they go to the princely palace? And the chronicle says no, they go straight to the moneylenders' quarter. And some would count it as the first instance of a pogrom in the land. However, there's sketchy evidence of popular protests, but also they would not be connected to the concept of popular politics as such. So I'm thinking of doing perhaps the first chapter leading to the great reforms of the 1860s and 70s, and then into the age of modern politics and participation. But that would make it an interesting book, going all the way back to 1113. But it would also require lots of guesswork, really. So I'm not quite sure about how to go about it. Like any specialists on medieval Russia are very welcome to contact me after the lecture.
You talked about the destruction of the Lenin Monument on what was then the Bosch-Joffrey.
Mm-hmm.
You said it took place, I think, 1990 or perhaps 1991. Very close to the Maidan was a Lenin, a huge monument to the building surrounded a great statue of Lenin. That also disappeared. And yet, somehow, despite numerous, several demonstrations, including, Kuchma or Krinovis Kuchma, tax demonstrations, and then the Orange Revolution, the monument to Lenin on Boulevard Shevchenko, which is also very close to the Maidan, survived. How did that monument survive when others fell? And how did it survive until December 2013?
Right. There's a certain logic there, which has something to do with the most visible symbol dominating the central political space, but also with the fact that Lenin monuments survived in significant parts of Ukraine, really. So there was never, I think, a consistent effort to remove all the monuments to Lenin. And so it happened as a result of popular action. So when the people protested and demanded, that happened. And when they did so, they focused on the central, the largest monument, which was right there on the Maidan. And they did not focus on the smaller one, which was opened in 1946, by the way. So what happened now was that people were actually looking for the focus of what needs to be removed in Kyiv, like what can we possibly protest, and they focused on this particular Lenin monument, but not just on it. Two other monuments suffered a very interesting fate, and I just wrote an introduction to another book, actually, where I start with this. One is the monument to Mykola Shorts, the Soviet hero of the Civil War, who liberated Kyiv in 1919, or you can say conquered, or whatever, which stands on the intersection of Shevchenko and Petlura Street today. And Petlura Street is the one leading to the railway station. So what happened during the Maidan now was that some protesters, without removing the monument, painted a different name on the foundation, and the name in question was Konovalets. So kind of mounted statue of some kind of warrior, whatever, from the age of heroic socialism, nationalism. So they just painted Konovalets, and also Heroyam Slava, glory to heroes. And there's also a monument in Mariinsky Park, which I'm actually studying in some depth. So this subject of the entire section of a chapter. And that is a monument of the revolutionary worker dating from 1967. It's just a revolutionary worker holding a banner. And of course, in Soviet times, you would assume it's a red banner. Like, what else can it possibly be? And so during the Maidan, somebody went there to the monument and painted a Ukrainian embroidery on the worker's shirt, and B, painted the banner in red and black. So without destroying a revolutionary monument, they actually made it a monument to a Ukrainian nationalist. So reclaimed it in such a way. So I managed to take pictures on time because I'm curious what is going in fact to happen, especially leading to the parliamentary elections. But what I find enormously fascinating about this is that these are the monuments of what we would call a totalitarian age. And somehow they are not destroyed, but they are reclaimed. So, and so, well, yeah, but can I say, Shors and Konovalets are in fact twins. They are the children of World War I. They are both junior officers of World War I. They didn't realize they were twins. So you can paint Shors into Konovalets, you can paint Konovalets into Shors, even so these are the two opposites, but they actually originate in this. Don't even get me started on Bandera, Andrew. Lenin and Bandera, it's an entirely, yes, they just changed the head, yes. But that's most curious, that this of course happens in the center of Kyiv, right, where you would expect all these revolutionary monuments. No. Just say Konovalets, and that's fine. Or just make him wave a flag of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and that's okay. So I'm looking forward to finding out what in fact happens to these monuments after the elections and during the electoral campaign, because these are very visible symbols in Kyiv. And also I have another paper coming out soon to be presented in Germany about Mariinsky Park, in which one of those monuments is standing. Of course, all the sites during the revolution and the civil war buried their dead in Mariinsky Park, in mass graves. And apparently some executed A revolutionaries, B counter-revolutionaries were all buried in Mariinsky Park as well. And then the Soviets marked this space with monuments, of which only one got vandalized during the protests, but that was the one closest to the parliament building. So I'm trying to make sense of this, but this is really a fascinating topic, really.
Maidan was obviously outside of the periods when there was intense political activities. It became a sort of a sense. It maintains this meaning. It had this meaning of a place where people would go to make speeches, to small mini rallies, and maybe it became a caricature of. I was at some of these events because Maidan was just such a central place, and there were always people that were selling things, books about Ukraine that were a bit, I think, extravagant.
Oh right. Oh yeah.
And then
okay.
national symbols, embroidery, music. So one could always, it became a place where one would naturally go to, even outside of these periods of protest. And the name of course gives it an aura. Maidan being the most important place. And then prior to that, in the Soviet period, Maidan Zhokhnevy Revolution, it's Zhokhnevy Revolution, of course, is the most important event in Soviet history. So these names gave it already a meaning and a certain aura.
Yeah.
And when I was in Kyiv in the late 1980s for 1 year, it was a natural place to gather or just to meet.
It was a cool place to hang out as well.
Cool place to hang out, and it was a good place because of the intersection of the two metro stations. So one could always make arrangements with friends who were coming either from one side of Kyiv or the other to meet up there. So it lends to its importance.
Yeah, it's also a meeting place of kind of dissident artists and poets. The underground passage in the 60s, which is known as Vtrubi, in the tunnel. And also, before I forget, and I would want it to be on the recording because then I can consult the recording and type it. Of course, what also happens in Soviet times is that every official holiday you have a parade. And the reviewing stand, the government reviewing stand, is right there, which also marks it as a place of authority, which, by the way, originally, the reviewing stand after the war was under the central department store. So I have that picture in the book, which already came out. But at some point, they also start conceptualizing the Maidan as this wide open space which should not be built. Instead, this is where you put the reviewing stand during the parades. Yeah. And of course, the name marks it as well. Except in my childhood, that was the Kalinin Square. Kalinin, Mikhail Kalinin. It's only actually renamed Zhutnevaya Revolution, October Revolution, in 1977 for the revolution's 60th anniversary. So that's a relatively late renaming, as a matter of fact. And these two squares in central Kyiv, they suffered through, the European one was first named after Stalin, then after Hitler, and then after Stalin again, and now it's European, which which of course was also the location of anti-Maidan at some point, right? The European square is the location of anti-Maidan, but the Independence Square is the location of Maidan, even so it's EuroMaidan. I wonder how much people in fact attach to the names. Rashad was Vorovskoho Street for a long time after Vorovsky was killed in the 20s. I think like in St. Petersburg and some other cities, lots of people all through this period actually referred to something by its old name, like Institutska Street, which was Karla Marxa, right, or whatever it was. All the streets in the historic part of town.
Sorry, if you covered this in the first half an hour, I apologize. But I'm curious what's happening with Russian churches on Ukraine side.
That was not really part of this because it's not marked by religious connotation. This political space, and that was my starting point really, that the traditional space of celebration was in Upper Town, next to the major cathedral, the oldest cathedral too. But then it moved down with the new age of modern politics. The Russian churches are still there. They're alive and well, as far as I know. And
are there any acts of anything that Ukraine has ruined about churches in Russia?
oh, that's a really complex issue because there are several Orthodox churches in Ukraine. And the largest of them recognizes the authorities of Moscow Patriarchate still. And there was an expectation, I think, in the wake of the Maidan that this church would be losing parishes and parishioners, but I don't think from my very non-specialist reading of the sources that this has been happening so far, because everybody is waiting for the position of the new head of the church, how he is going to position himself on these issues. I mean, I think there are people in the audience who are way better qualified to answer this question, really.
I don't know whether you know, but today they started a petition in Russia in order to elevate Putin to the role of Tsar, to crown him. So I certainly hope that we don't see the form to live in place, replaced with Tsar Putin. But over and beyond that unpleasant note, I do have two questions concerned with both fashions on the Maidan and architecture on the Maidan. You sort of hinted a little bit about the architecture. You said you will have photographs and all that. I'm curious whether people are critical of the way the Maidan was refashioned in 2001. I personally find the Archangel Michael and the Lady of Independence and the band with the Serhy Yekelchyk not appropriate for a postmodern city. It's as if they had no aesthetic ambition in Kyiv at all, which bothers me a lot, being my maternal city. That is one question. And the second question concerns fashion. Have you seen any kind of development in the way the protesters dress? And the reason I'm asking is because in the Russian journal of Nako, 2 or 3 days ago, I don't have the exact date, but I can send it to you, some gentleman wrote about the horrible meaning of the vyshyvanki, and that they are a sign of barbarism and the degradation of the beautiful Russian urban civilization, and that Russians have to worry about the influx of embroideries, and that it's a sign of the peripheries having a negative influence throughout the Eurasian spread of the Russian Empire. A very chauvinistic artist. So I'm curious whether you will be looking at the way people dressed. When were the vyshyvanki introduced as a symbol of protest? I saw the pictures from 1917, and people were dressed differently than they are today. So does that enter your plans?
I don't know. On the first question, Natalia, Krещатик used to be architecturally interesting.
It did, it was.
Mm-hmm. The Duma building was architecturally interesting, and then the 1920s and the 1930s saw construction of some modernist buildings. The old post office, which was only blown up recently, which marked the old street line, was beautiful now that I think about it. And of course, the only one still standing of those is the Central Department Store, which was designed by the same architectural, they call them brigade of architects that designed the Lenin Mausoleum on Red Square, which we don't think of as the modernist, but I kind of enjoy the thought that the Lenin Mausoleum is in fact a modernist artifact of architecture, and that our Central Department Store looks a lot like the Lenin Mausoleum. And it's still standing. Now, the architecture of the Maidan itself is all from the early 50s. Khrushchev had a hand in designing these things, or kind of issuing demands for architects. Also, that was also the time when his favorite architect, Alexander Vlasov, moved to Moscow, and another architect came into place. Some wedding cake style decorations were removed at the last moment from the original plans that we can consult. That were for public display, actually, for competitions. And then some Soviet buildings from the 80s, such as the burned down house of the trade unions, which is now, in fact, people are discussing what is going to happen to it. And as some of you know, it has been decorated with 2 huge Ukrainian flags, so that you don't actually see the burnt shell of the building. Now about Vyshyvanki, this is the entire separate big topic, which I could probably go on for a while. Actually, Bogdan could talk about, Antonovich and the invention of Vyshyvanki as symbol in the 19th century of Ukrainian identity. But it's probably beyond Vyshyvanki, and in fact, I was contemplating something about the fatigues, the military fatigues, in combination with some Cossack dress, which you would see on Maidan only in the spring, probably not anymore. And this military fatigues becoming fashionable to a degree. and what does that mean, but also in a larger context of charismatic captains, sotniki, right, making demands on the government and denouncing ministers on Facebook and ministers responding on Facebook, thinking of how much it is like the civil war, like Makhno and the others, and also this principle of which Petlura apparently endorsed, of forming the Ukrainian army by giving a large sum of money to the Ottoman in charge, who would then raise a unit, a battalion at the time, but by so doing also become a political figure. And then, of course, the Ukrainian government of the day was left dealing with these new political figures, which it, in fact, created. And that has a lot to do with the last part of it, about potential legacies of the Maidan, people whose authority is vested in their role during the revolution, and why is everybody now wearing fatigue for photo ops and such. I think it's a very interesting topic. I'm not sure if I'll get to cover it in my project, but it really deserves attention on its own, big time, I would say. The symbolism of these greetings could be a topic of a totally separate book on when exactly, but also the tree, right? The tree on Maidan, which was transformed from an urban kind of Christmas celebration, New Year celebration symbol into a political space of posters and such, and was left intentionally unassembled or not fully assembled, but became a political symbol. In fact, an artist friend of mine painted a bit impressionist landscape over Maidan. The problem is that the tree is very centrally there, so you couldn't use it for the cover of the book, because if you use it for the cover of the book, a Western audience would think, what is this tree? Is it a painting of some kind of Christmas carnival, right? So because it was reclaimed from a New Year symbol into political symbol, but it's not necessarily obvious from that. And perhaps, yes, I knew I forgot something. Plans to memorize the victims, the Heavenly 100, those who died on the Maidan, the construction of various monuments proposed, designed by various artists and architects, or possibly preserving parts of the Maidan as they stand now. This is really an important moment in that it shows that this space, which is political space, as I have been talking for a long time now, could also become a memorial space of memorialization. So, and in so doing, of course, its meaning would be frozen in time, codified, and in some way constructed. And there are, of course, interesting works on that too, how we create memorials and how exactly political events are constructed in trying to memorize them. That would be very interesting to observe. This is going to unfold in the near future, actually.
Well, if there are no more questions, I would like to thank Professor Yekelchyk for a wonderful presentation.